You're watching News at Prime, and it is the special hour, as I choose to call it. Let's get into this conversation now. South Africa continues to battle corruption as the country marks 30 years of democracy. The billions lost to graft often has the biggest impact on the most vulnerable, affecting government's ability to provide homes, quality health care, and other infrastructure challenges. Let's speak now about this, and hoping that she is going to join us at any moment is former public protector, Advocate Thuli Madonsela, and in studio with me right now is the CEO of the organization Undoing Tax Abuse, or Outa for short, Wayne Duvenage. Wayne, let's kick off the conversation. The Prof will find us on the way. I want to take us back to the period preceding democracy. This was the period of transition. Slap bang, 1994 happens, and the ANC-led government inherits a near bankrupt state from the apartheid regime. Remind us what that was characterized by. Why is it that the ANC-led government at that time, under Mandela's stewardship, inherited a near bankrupt state?
Well, I think we were a state that was too caught up in an illegitimate war, sanctions, so much that was taking us down the wrong path as a nation. We were decades or centuries, as some would say, behind where we should have been as a country, involving everybody, and we could have developed ourselves into a leading country on the African continent. And I think we quickly stepped into that place, and we could see how a well-run country in a democratic process was able to shed itself of that load, of that baggage, of that debt, and start to build a country that was respected in the world, on the world stage, and had a vast opportunity ahead of it to bring everybody on board and move forward. So we were in a dire situation. But I think in every situation that any country can find itself in, you can turn it around very quickly if you have the building blocks and the right recipe and processes and formulas to bring everybody into the mainstream economy. And that's where we were really born and destined for an amazing future.
I like how you set that tone for the conversation we're about to have, because one of the people that were central to the CODESA negotiations was quoted in a Sunday Times article this past weekend, Rolf Meyer, talking about the glorious years, 10 to 15 years of what really South Africa became after 1994, enjoying levels of growth, economic growth we had never experienced before. But the professor has joined us, so let's welcome her into the conversation. Professor Madonsela, good evening to you, and thank you for your time. I was asking Wayne Duvenage to take us back in the period before 1994, and of course, when the ANC-led government eventually took power, that they inherited a nearly bankrupt state. Do you remember what that was characterized by?
Well, it was following the sanctions and a lot of corruption also in terms of sanctions busting, and the state coffers were emptied. The state pension fund was under the threat of being unable to fulfill its obligations, and companies such as Eskom were not as high performing as they finally did under the Mandela years.
The professor talks about state coffers having been emptied, and so corruption does not necessarily start with the ANC-led government, does it?
No, not at all. I think our apartheid government was equally corrupt in dealing with so many challenges and trying to balance the books. I think there were also opportunities, as every government finds itself in, to take funds out of the coffers where they should have been going to. I mean, we should never have been spending the amount of money that we were. And in any situation where there's arms deals that are happening, illegitimate trade taking place, there are a lot of middlemen that slot into those revenue opportunities. And so I think we lost a lot of money.
Professor Madonsela, in trying to move this story forward now, because we have looked in the past, and it's the right thing to do, because the ANC government will say, but we're not the only people that should and can be accused of such while in office. But when does trouble start for the ANC-led government, where they struggle with the sins of incumbency, corruption, essentially?
Well, the corruption, as you said, Thuli, greetings to you and to viewers, started immediately. If you listen to some of the speeches of President Nelson Mandela, he was already concerned about corruption and about the pushback he was getting as he was pushing back against corruption. Part of the problem, though, with how we deal with corruption is we leave business out of it. The state of South Africa was built on corruption from the very beginning. It was a business enterprise, and when government came into power, from the days of Cecil John Rhodes, there was always corrupt ways of getting government to do things in favor of business. And Nick Dow and Matthew Black have written a lot and quite hilariously about what we went to. Then secondly, about when did things go wrong? People will say to you things started going pear-shaped insofar as corruption, primarily during state capture, and I will agree with you. But I will say that if it wasn't for the economic difficulties people had in experiencing upward mobility for hard work, it would not have been easy to have a Zuma presidency. A Zuma presidency was enabled by an economy that was growing without jobs and an economy that was hijacked by big business introducing BEE as a substitute for Chapter 5 of the Equality Act. Chapter 5, which was meant to redress the legacy of apartheid on all of South Africa, not just the politically connected.
Professor Madonsela talks about corruption starting in earnest back in the early 90s. And in all honesty, it does not start with state capture, which is the subject she's just ended with. It started with the arms deal, or am I wrong?
I think it started with so many things. The arms deal is the big one, and Andrew Feinstein writes a lot about that when he was in Scopa in his book as early back as the turn of the century. Yes, so that is one big issue which was exposed, but there was a lot of what is happening, opportunities that have taken place. I think what happened was when Jacob Zuma came into power, things started to go pear-shaped because it became brazen. And it became a deliberate attempt to take those opportunities. It was headlines daily, weekly, from Nkandla, SAA, the list is long, we just see it. And it was a rolling situation. Prior to that, in the in the Madiba and Becky years, we had a focus on good administration, on making sure that people who filled positions were qualified for those positions. There was less, I'm not saying there wasn't any, cadre deployment, so to speak, but what we saw as Jacob Zuma came into power, and it hasn't stopped since then, is that cronyism, nepotism has become rife. Deliberate placing of people into positions of networks to take the opportunities of money that come into the system, and it's rife across most sectors in government, from national to local, and it's getting worse. I would hazard a guess to say, from what we see, corruption in the state and in government is worse today than it was under the state capture years of Jacob Zuma, because there's no accountability, there are no consequences, and when it's so brazen and so obvious and nothing happens, and we can talk about the Gauteng health stuff, we can talk about NSFAS, the CETAs, that list goes on, and everybody looks away, right from the top. Then you join the dots, as the famous saying goes, and we worry that it's getting out of hand now.
Professor Madonsela, Wayne Duvenage talks about cronyism, and I'm purposefully delaying us getting to the state capture years because I suddenly remember one ANC member or leader who said, I did not struggle to be poor. Those were in the Mbeki years, was it not?
It was. I want to agree with Wayne that corruption under Nelson Mandela was minimal, under President Mbeki was minimal, and under President Zuma, it was rapid and rapid. But where I disagree with my colleague, with due respect, is cadre deployment. The height of cadre deployment was during Nelson Mandela. My first deployment to the Department of Justice would probably have been cadre deployment, even though it might not have been from a committee. But that was when highly skilled members of the ANC who had been trained for specific positions were deployed into appropriate posts. Kala Omar, Justice, Zolas Kweya, Public Service and Administration, Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma, Health, etc. If you look at the dictionary meaning of cadre deployment, it's when you deploy the best. China still does cadre deployment. Singapore does cadre deployment. When we had the Zuma years, it was not cadre deployment. It was chronism. It was people who were deployed as proxies of Mr. Zuma and his proxies into positions where they would continue supporting them. Some would have supported him during his electoral process, and they were rewarded with positions. And some were placed in strategic positions specifically not to advance the interests of the people, to advance the business interests of President Zuma's son, Duduzane, and the interests of the Guptas, which business interests were in companies that were co-owned by these two families.
Yeah. Wayne, we are now effectively in the post-state capture era, but what you said moments earlier is reason for everybody to worry when you say corruption has not abated despite the Commission of Inquiry into state capture. Why is that the issue? Why is there not a reversal of corruption instead of it being ramped up, as you put it?
Yeah, and it's a question we ask every day. I mean, remember when President Ramaphosa came into power, he came into power on the back of an anti-corruption ticket. Remember the Tumamina speeches and so forth. We were excited about that because at one stage we even had a strategic session saying, well, does an organization like Outa have a role if this is going to pan out? I mean, the happiest days of our lives we would have lived ahead knowing that we would be able to wrap up Outa because corruption is taken care of. Well, that hasn't happened. In fact, what we see coming at us is like this wave after wave, whistleblowers giving us evidence of what is happening, policies that are being put in place that have various dubious question marks around them. And it hasn't abated. But the saddest thing is that it is permeated from national. So we looked at state capture in the Jacob Zuma years and the Guptas and the brazen conduct that was taking place at SAA, at all the state-owned entities. And that conduct is permeated right down to local government. So at local government level, the saddest thing is where we live and work and try and enjoy our lives, we see the degradation around us, worse in the rural areas, worse in the small towns, and happening right here in the economic hub of South Africa, of Africa, in Johannesburg. And we see a mismanagement, maladministration of funds that are meant to go and develop our towns and cities, our provinces, housing, schools, clinics, money that's not getting to where it should, and the poorest of the poor suffer the most. And it hasn't abated. It's got worse. I can assure you that. We are wasting far too much money that should be put to good use. Leading in the best interest of the people is not central to what we see in government at all levels.
Professor Madonsela, before we take a quick break, I see you shaking your head. Do you want to weigh in on what Wayne has just said?
I share the concerns of my colleague about corruption, but I simply do not agree with him that it has gotten worse. And the only way to really resolve this debate is for me and him to go and get the figures, and then we have another debate with you here. I think there's been a lot that has been done to push back against corruption, and the Minister of Justice gave us figures of money recovered from companies such as the ones that were involved at Eskom, those that were involved at SARS, one that was involved at SARS. I don't want to mention the companies, but the monies were recovered. Of course, when it comes to prosecution, it's a matter for the NPA. We cannot blame government. But new cases of corruption have really subsided. We're dealing with old cases. Yes, there were new cases during COVID-19, but there was accountability. So I disagree with my colleague that there is impunity, and that I disagree on the point that there's more accountability in the last 5 years, and that there's more impunity in the last 5 years. But I say, let's both use evidence.
You're watching News at Prime. If you're just joining us, we are discussing South Africa and the kind of battle it has had to wage against corruption. And we look back in the era before democracy, and then the period that then was a beautiful period. 10, 15 years of what was a country characterized by growth, economic growth, and then things just took a turn for the worst. Wayne Duvenage, let's pick up on what Professor Thuli Madonsela is suggesting. And that is a view of a number of other people, that this is the age of accountability. And she's saying, if we are going to say that corruption is exacerbating, we best use evidence. And so what are you basing your statement on when you say corruption is getting worse?
Okay, so remember, we operate in the space that the corruption, we see it all around us. So let me put it another way. Of course, there are cases and successful cases that are unfolding, far less than where we should be. I mean, I would hate to think of where we would be today if Sean Abrams was still heading up the NPA. So I think Shamila, between the team and the introduction of the ID, has come a long way, and there's a lot that is happening. But there is so much more that can and should have happened by now. So let me give you just a couple of examples. In the higher education space, in NSFAS and the SETAs, I mean, we see this all the time. Ndile Nongogo, the CEO at NSFAS, came from Services SETA. We exposed a lot of corruption. Still found his way into a CEO position. By June last year, we were raising the flag. There are some serious questions we have here. Yeah. We were told by the minister there's nothing untoward going on. 3 months later, he was fired because eventually they had to do an independent report. The chairperson of NSFAS, Ernest Khoza, is there and is implicated because he knows what's going on. The minister puts him into that position. He's now resigned. There's so much happening. And I'm talking about in the SETAs as well. All of this under the minister, Bladen Zamande's watch. Yeah. Now, if I was the president and this is happening, I would be very concerned. If in fact if I was the minister, I'd be very concerned. What do we see happening? Not one person held accountable. People are allowed to resign, and they pop up elsewhere. This happens a lot. We see people moving. The fire gets hot in the kitchen. They're allowed to escape, and they pop up somewhere else. We need accountability. We need action to be taken. We need people to be rounded up, investigations, independent done, and then take them on. None of that happens. If I was the president, and this is happening in a very serious portfolio in the country, the poorest of the poor, the students who need these finances, people who benefit out of skills development, we are losing out. And nothing happens. Now, that's just in that area. If you look across the country, it's happening in so many areas. So are we serious about tackling corruption? Are we serious about the fact that we build homes, RDP homes for the poor, and then uninhabitable? Are we serious about the type of corruption that is taking place every single day? And nobody, well, I shouldn't never say nobody, very few are held accountable at the scale that we're seeing it. That's what we're talking about. It's not got much better.
Yeah.
We shouldn't be where we are right now.
Professor Madonsela, there is your evidence when you say it's got to be evidence-based, because you've got to ask yourself the question, how many people are sitting in jail owing to state capture? You've got to ask yourself the PPE scandals. Yes, we've seen people resign, but I don't remember, frankly, those that are sitting in jail. So where is this age of accountability? Or when does it start?
Insofar as accountability is concerned, we must agree whether the definition is the same. For me, accountability includes pushing a person to resign. As somebody who's worked in this area for 7 years and worked in government before, I also understand that it's much easier to investigate a matter when a person has resigned, because now you can have access to evidence. It's not true that once a person has been pushed to resign, there's no accountability. Criminal accountability has nothing to do with you remaining in office. The only kind of accountability that you can escape by resigning is losing your job. But you've already lost your job by resigning. So if you're a civil servant and you're in the process of being held accountable under the Public Service Act and you resign, then you won't be accountable. But parastatals are not, people in parastatals are not appointed on the basis of the Public Service Act. So I just think we need to educate those outside in civil society how the polycentric accountability framework works. So the hawks can still touch you. This SIU can still ask you questions. The NPA can still touch you should the police find you guilty. I still am saying my colleague has not given me evidence. He's only given us the Department of Education. And my colleague, with due respect, also says corruption is now also spread to local government. That is not true. There's always been corruption under local government. I was public protector for 7 years. And that was 6 years ago. I ended 6 years ago. There was corruption in local government. Some of the big cases of non-delivery, like, for example, pipes to nowhere, were local government cases. Some of the cases where one RDP house was delivered instead of the whole amount being of houses being delivered was in local government. So I'm not defending and saying nothing is happening. There's no corruption. What I'm saying is that it's not true that there's less accountability. In my view, there's far more accountability that has happened since this administration. SARS has been cleaned up and it's under good hands. And those who had stolen from SARS have been made to pay back the money. Yes, there's not been criminal accountability, but the criminal accountability does not lie in the hands of the politicians. The day politicians decide who gets arrested and who goes to jail is when you are having the hijacking of the law enforcement agencies. But insofar as these other processes of accountability, I sit in the Gauteng Anti-Corruption Advisory Council. We see accountability. Yes, there is one case, which I won't mention here, where we've been pushing to see more accountability, where the process of holding them accountable has been taking far too long. But again, with the PPE, there were people who were forced to resign, including the minister concerned, and those who were involved in the PPE are currently, as we speak, being prosecuted. So again, if the criminal justice process is taking too long, let's insist that going forward, we have an anti-corruption court similar to the Equality Court that will make sure that these matters are handled on an expedited basis. But we can't get politicians involved in ensuring that there's criminal accountability, because politics will color the situation.
If you're just joining us, you find us at the tail end of a conversation around how the country is dealing with corruption. All right, Wayne Duvenage, let's give you the opportunity. Professor Madonsela is very clear that politicians should not and cannot dictate how corruption is dealt with in the country. I'm hoping that I am not misrepresenting what she has said. In fact, she's still here to tell me that if she thinks I'm misrepresenting her. But your response, please.
Yeah, so firstly, I never said that local government is now just suddenly corruption. I know, Thuli, quite right. Local government, corruption, local government's been around a long time. It's just so sad to see every day. Every day we see roads, bases done, fully paid for, project abandoned, toilets, housing developments, just the list goes on. It's crazy that we still have this today. In the space of politicians or politics and accountability, that's where I disagree with my colleague here. As an employer, if there is wrongdoing, so let's take a state-owned entity. Let's take Duvenage as the director, the chairperson. When things go wrong, and these are state entities, so state departments, take government, Gauteng Health, with all the corruption that's taken around PPE, it is my responsibility as the politician in charge of the Gauteng Department of Health, or national, or SAA, or state-owned entities, to make sure that administration takes place properly. And if you're found wanting, and if you've broken the PFMA or the Municipal Finance Management Act, that action is taken against you. What so often happens, and it also happens in the corporate sector, which is wrong. And I'm not saying business is squeaky clean. They're the other side of the corruption coin. But in my days in the business, when somebody is found wanting, you take action. And if they try and resign, well, on their record is not resignation. The hearing continues, the dismissal takes place, and then the charges take place. And then you follow up with the police to make sure that those investigations, and give them all the evidence. And that doesn't happen. And government, the politicians, the people in power must make sure that all that happens. So, for instance, we believe there are cases at Road Accident Fund, in many places where our money is being used. People are getting away, they're not being held, they're not being charged for delinquent director status, which they can be because they're on boards. All of this stuff just disappears when people resign. You cannot just let people escape the noose and, okay, well, they're fine, don't worry, the police might pick them up, the hawks might pick them up, the criminal justice system might pick them up. But they don't, they often escape that net. And you still have a duty, a responsibility as the head of that department to hold those people to account and make sure that the charges are laid. And in fact, that ex-board of SAA, they should be all declared delinquent directors. We had to take Duvenage on and have it declared. Why are we doing government's work? Government must do that work. Those are the powers that people in positions of authority have, and they're not exercising it.
Professor Madonsela, I'm desperate to move from this topic, but I'd like for you to respond to Wayne, if you can, please.
Yeah, just a quick one to correct that. I'm not saying it's not government's work or government's responsibility to hold people accountable. I say it's not the politician's job to ensure who gets arrested and who gets prosecuted. Of course, my colleague Wayne is right that whoever is responsible for the department is not only morally responsible to ensure that the matter is reported to the police, they're also legally responsible under the Prevention and Combating of Corrupt Activities Act. And these matters have been reported. Where I disagree with him is that we should keep you and you continue intimidating witnesses. If there's a way of pushing you to resign, I would rather push you to resign. And then, but that should not be the end of the matter. The matter then should then be prosecuted appropriately. The public service has stringent rules on firing people. So you don't want to keep them in the system whilst they are responsible for intimidating witnesses. At the very least, you may then want to suspend them.
Yeah.
I do insist, though, that we need evidence that shows that the number of new cases of corruption has increased, because I am 100% sure that that's not true.
Wayne, I'd like for us to now wrap this up, but I want us to wrap it looking at what the NPA is doing. Earlier, you touched on what you said was the other side of the corruption coin. That's private sector corruption. Yeah. The NPA talks about the corporate alternative dispute resolution policy directive, and they're saying that this is going to enhance anti-corruption efforts. Do you believe that that possibly is the solution here?
Well, it's not the only solution, but it's another mechanism, and we welcome it as well, because sometimes you can fast track and get people held accountable, companies as well, but more so the individuals. Remember, a brand is not corrupt. It may seem to be corrupt when but people behave in a corrupt way. Businesses, the brand doesn't have a brain, it doesn't think. It's the people inside. So it's the directors. We've seen it, KPMG, McKinsey. There's been a lot of examples, Bain, SAP, ABB, and a number of them. And what we don't want is people just to pay fines quickly and be let off the hook. This alternative dispute resolution process is a good one in that, tell everything, bring us the picture of everyone involved, because now you start getting the people inside government who are signing the checkbook, so to speak. Yeah. We want them as well. We want you to pay back, and we want you to go after the people inside your own organization who very often are let go of and golden handshakes given. How many people did we see leaving these entities after the corruption? Nothing happened. Yeah. They need to be gone after. You've got the minutes and the meeting and all the records. Lay the charges. And so this new mechanism, it was not new, it's been around for some time, but now they're going to be formalizing and using it more effectively, is great, because it has a number of arrows in the quiver of accountability, so the individuals on all sides and other companies involved start being brought into the net. Yeah. Fines are, money is recovered. So we think that when this process starts to unfold and businesses say, right, we want to participate in this, it's far quicker and better, and accountability starts to take place, other than if you go the other route where you have these long drawn-out court cases, people have moved on, immigrated out, and they've escaped the net. So we think it's going to help, but don't just let that be the only mechanism. Let's also just follow the full enforcement processes in the whole criminal justice system. We want to start seeing people behind bars from the corporate side as well as the state side in the exacerbated amount of corruption that's taking place.
Prof. Madonsela, you get to have the last word, and I wonder whether the corruption spotlight is harsh enough on the private sector corruption. These take ages for the prosecuting authority to process. And, for example, look at the moment that I suspect many people say was stolen from South Africa, to see Marcus Jooste being led to a court of law and sitting in the dock, and unfortunately that wasn't to be.
Well, that's true. I think that's a valid point, that us as civil society need to make sure that corruption is called, whether it's in the Western Cape where it has happened or it's in the national government where it has happened. Corruption is called even when it happens in the private sector. Just talking about the Steinhoff matter. Everywhere else in the world, particularly Germany, Steinhoff was held accountable. But here in this country, the process was ultra slow, but I didn't hear much from us as civil society questioning it. Secondly, corruption is a symptom of a corrupt society. People don't become corrupt, as my colleague correctly said, simply because they're in a particular company, in a particular brand, or in a particular political party, or in a particular government. People are corrupt because they come from a society that is having a high tolerance for corruption. During state capture years, there was a moment when civil society was seized with an anti-corruption, unwavering anti-corruption mindset. We need to do the same now. Whether corruption is happening in the Western Cape or in the national government, let the voices be loud. But also, let's be honest when good work is done. I am not convinced, for example, that we've seen more corruption in the last few years. Yes, the remnant of state capture were in the system, so some of the corruption was bound to continue. That there is no accountability, I disagree with. But lastly, dear colleagues, if we feel that there's no accountability, there is a public protector. A lot of the cases that I dealt with that ended up being pushed to the other law enforcement agencies were brought to the public protector. Hence, our anti-corruption system is called a polycentric accountability framework. It includes us as civil society. That is why Outa has the power to hold a director of a company accountable, even though they're not shareholders in that company. It was part of the architecture that it's not just government, it's not just the police, it's not just the public protector, it's us too that are part of combating corruption.
Professor Thuli Madonsela, thank you very much for your time and indeed your contribution this evening. Wayne Duvenage, CEO of Outa, thank you very much for your contribution this evening. And that brings us to the final hour of News at Prime, the 8 p.m. hour. Thank you for joining us. We will do this again tomorrow. Thank you for watching. Thabo Mdluli up next with In Focus.